Hello everybody, welcome to Theology 101. Today I'm going to examine whether nations are a result of sin. Some Christians assume that the nations we see in the world today is a result of sin because of the Tower of Babel story. According to this narrative, God judged mankind for gathering to build a tower to heaven by confusing their language. Instead of having one common language, a diversity of languages came about which forced the people to leave Babel. Thus, the nations of the world came about because of this event. So is it true that nations are a result of sin? Let's jump in to find out. To understand the Babel story, we must first look at the Table of Nations. The Table of Nations lists 72 nations that were created from the Tower of Babel event. These 72 nations are alluded to in the New Testament when Jesus appoints 72 workers to preach the gospel, referring to the fact that Jesus is spreading his message to the nations of the world. Now there is tension when reading Genesis chapter 10 and Genesis chapter 11. On the one hand, Genesis chapter 11 gives a picture of man's pride and rebellion against God. On the other hand, Genesis chapter 10 gives a neutral account that seems to contradict the Babel narrative. If the Table of Nations are listed after the Babel story, then it makes sense to say that nations are a result of sin. However, the Table of Nations is listed before the Tower of Babel story and after God commanded Noah this. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." This commandment repeats what God originally commanded Adam and Eve, showing that God has always intended mankind to fill the earth with the diversity of nations. So the Table of Nations is listed after God's command to Noah to show that God does create a multitude of nations, but the way he does this is through a surprising event, the Tower of Babel. Just as Genesis chapter 2 explains in detail the creation account from Genesis chapter 1, so also Genesis chapter 11 describes in detail the origin of the nations listed in Genesis chapter 10. Now I want to make a few observations from the Tower of Babel story. First, nations came about because of God's intervention. Previously, God commanded Noah and his family to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But we see that people have settled in the land. Settled is the complete opposite picture of filling the earth and shows how mankind has directly disobeyed God's command. Second, God's intervention was a form of punishment. Before Babel, humans were united. But after Babel, it became divided. This so-called unity is seen with the use of the adjective one speech, one word, and one people. This desire for unity is an act of rebellion. We see that mankind wanted to build a tower to make a name for themselves. In response, God confuses their language with a purpose so that one could not understand another. Why does he do this? Because he wants them to fill the earth just as he previously commanded. But God's intervention was not simply to confuse people, but to force them to spread apart, multiply, and fill the earth. Finally, God's intervening act was also preventative. There is a pattern in Genesis chapter 1 through 11 when God's punishment is also a way to protect his people. For example, God kicking Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden was not just a punishment, but a form of grace. How? Because he did not allow them to eat from the tree of life and stay in a sinful state forever. In other words, God is giving them a chance to be redeemed by kicking them out of the garden. In the same way, the confusion of language is necessary to prevent humans from uniting so that they could fulfill God's mandate to fill the earth. Now, some Christians assume that nations are a product of sin and that culture is rebellion against God. Based on this assumption, there's a need to reverse the effects of Babel by uniting all nations into one people. However, knowing how to reconcile God's providence and man's responsibility in his sin will correct this misconception. There are two implications that reconcile the tension between God's providence and God's judgment. First, God's providence included his intervention to scatter mankind. The narrative of Babel recalls the story of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. In the garden, the issue was the newly acquired knowledge of Adam and Eve, whereas in Babel, the issue was their desire for power. In both cases, God was not trembling in fear because of how people were acting, because God's providence can never be challenged. Instead, God was grieved over the consequences that would happen if he does not intervene. Although God was judging the pride of the people in Babel, the results of different nations, languages, and cultures were not a byproduct of sin. Instead, the Babel narrative was the beginning steps of God's plan to create a multitude of nations. The second implication is that God providentially brought about positive results from a negative situation. On the surface, God preventing the building of this tower might seem like a punishment, but in the larger picture of God's purposes, it was a way to make sure that humanity will receive the blessing given in the Noahic covenant. I will go over what that blessing is in a future video about the Noahic covenant. For now, it is important to know that God providentially brought about positive results from a negative situation. The same irony occurs in the New Testament. Jesus told his disciples to spread out from Jerusalem and to make disciples of all the nations. However, we see that they don't leave Jerusalem immediately. Thus, God allows persecution to enter Jerusalem, which forced them to go to Judea, Samaria, and other regions, just as Jesus wanted them to do before he ascended back to heaven. Also, it seems that the apostles recognized that God always intended to create a diversity of nations, even though it came through a negative event. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. In summary, the Babel event ultimately resulted in God creating a multitude of nations, as listed in the table of nations, who will be blessed through Abraham. So are nations a result of sin? Not quite. Instead, we see that God not only created a multitude of nations, but will continue to have them in his kingdom, just as the Apostle John records. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." Thank you to today's sponsor, Awe and Reverence. They offer a free digital worship music app called Maskill. If you want to find out more, I'll leave some links in the description box below. If you missed the previous Q&A video about Christian nationalism, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. Until next time, see you.